Today is a very special day. We are rereading Harry Potter as a 30-something.
Hello book friends! Today I am starting a new series and I'm super excited. I hope this series is as fun for you as it is for me and nostalgic, and I'll just get right to it. So I'm going to be rereading Harry Potter in my 30s, all of the books. So I read the Harry Potter series in its entirety only once. Starting in second grade, I read the first book, and then I read each book as they were released, with the last book being in high school. I never went back and reread any of the other books, never did any sort of refresher when I was about to read a new book. So it took me about 10 years to get through the series, and I haven't touched it since. Which, I mean, really is very strange because I had such a good time reading every single book. I thought each book was amazing, but for some reason I just never wanted to go back and reread it. I also watched the movies as they were released, and since then I have rewatched the entire series of movies multiple times. Whenever I need like a pick-me-up or I just want to watch something comforting, I'll watch one of them. There have been a few times in the last few years that I just marathoned all of them because I like them so much. But I never thought to reread any of the books, which is odd. I mean, maybe it's because I was just not into reading that much until recently, and the idea of rereading a book kind of felt like a waste of time, but my opinion is definitely changing on rereading. I used to see reading more as like a task to do, and then once I accomplish a book, I'm like, okay, good, done with that book. Never need to read it again because I can say I read it. But I'm starting to see reading more now as just comforting entertainment, so I have nothing against rereading books, and so I am going to reread this series purely for my own entertainment. I am just hoping to thoroughly enjoy myself. The Harry Potter series really just was my childhood. As I said, I read the first book in second grade, and I say I read it, and I feel like I really did read it, but then my mom was talking about how she was reading it to me, so maybe I didn't read it myself. Maybe my mom read it to me. But regardless, I consumed that book for the first time in second grade, and it was amazing. It felt like such a cool new world, and it was just so magical for little me, who was just in a boring elementary school, to go and visit this world that was just so cool and so magical. So many good memories reading that book. Even going to the movies with friends, everything about the Harry Potter world brings back just such nice nostalgic memories, and I want to feel that again. So yeah, I am super excited to start this series. This is not going to be a series that takes me 6 months. Like, you won't be seeing installments of this series until the end of the year. This is a series that is going to be done probably within the next 6 weeks. At this point, I'm planning on reading one book per week so that I read some other things in between, and I'm not just a Harry Potter freak for the next 2 weeks, although I probably could. If I really wanted to like marathon all the books, I probably could get them done in the next 2 weeks. But at this rate, I'm going to try to pace myself as much as I can. I'm planning on reading one book per week and doing one vlog per book. So yeah, for the next 7 weeks, I will have a Harry Potter themed vlog just about my experience reading the books. I will discuss the books with some spoilers. I feel like that's okay because, I mean, who hasn't read Harry Potter at this point? And if you haven't read Harry Potter, you probably wouldn't be watching videos of a woman in her 30s reading a children's book for the first time and getting all sappy over it. So that is the plan. I am so excited to get started. I have a couple of the books here that I just borrowed. So yeah, we are gonna get started reading Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, and I will update you when I get started and I start feeling all the feels. And yeah, let's go.
surface. I wasn't okay, I made it look the way. I'm saying you deserved it, sometimes it just happens that way. Sooner or later, we can become strangers. Someday, somewhere, we can be new again. We can be anything that we wanted to be back then.
Hello book friends, welcome to my closet floor. So I am working on reading Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, and so far I'm having a just really great time. I didn't think I was gonna have a bad time, but I didn't think I'd be having such a good time. So I read the first 8 chapters, which is almost exactly halfway. So that's where I am. So this book, it's a lot shorter than I think. So when I first read this book in like 2nd grade, I think it was just daunting as a 2nd grader, but this book is actually a lot shorter than you would think it is. So it's just kind of like a one-day read for an adult. I'm probably not going to read the entire thing today, but I mean, it definitely could be. It's just over 300 pages. It's kind of like single, well, 1.5 spaced, and it's going really quickly. I think I read this section in, I don't know, a couple of hours. Like it was just really quick and really easy, and it feels so fast paced. And yeah, so I'm having a great time so far. One thing that I'm trying to keep in mind is that as I'm reading, I really have the movie playing in my head. I read the series only once all the way through, but I have watched the movies multiple times. And so I'm trying to be mindful of having the movies playing in my head and seeing if that's gonna mess with my imagery of like how I conjure it up in my own head. So, but I actually do kind of remember how I thought of things back in the day when I read it the first time before the movies. So yeah, I'm trying to just use that imagery as best I can and be mindful of how things are described just in the writing so that I'm not kind of cheating by having the movie images in my head. I think when I was younger, just reading felt a lot more daunting, as you would expect, as like I was like an 8-year-old reading this book for the first time. And so I think I was just feeling like I was working a lot harder in order to make sure I was comprehending what I was reading. But now as an adult, I'm not so worried about it, and I've just had more practice reading. And so I'm picking up on things that I never picked up on back then. A lot of that is just the little humorous moments and the tone and things that I just wasn't paying attention to back then because I wanted to really make sure I was comprehending the story. So I was like, just from the very first page, I'm just gonna read you the first page so you can really get a sense of just the tone and how the book starts off and how it's just so engaging from the first page. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal. Thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large mustache. Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck, which came in very useful as she spent so much of her time craning over garden fences, spying on the neighbors. Like that sort of tone, I would have gone just right over my head when I was a kid. But now reading it as an adult, I appreciate things like that more as an adult. And so I'm just having a great time with it, but so far it's already been amazing. One thing I noticed with a lot of books, especially books that are meant to be a series, is that the first book spends a lot of time describing things and just being a setup for the rest of the series, and so the first book itself can get a little bit boring, it drags, and it just feels very explainy, and it takes a while for the plot to really become apparent, and in the meantime you just kind of feel like you're not sure really what is happening. But I don't get that from this book, even though like I know the plot is gonna get a lot bigger, and especially in this first half of the first book,
what I know to be the plot is not really that apparent. Like, Voldemort has been brought up a few times, but Harry and the reader and everybody is really not sure what they're supposed to do with that information about Voldemort. But I really like that each chapter really just feels like it's its own little short story. Each chapter has like a beginning, middle, and end, and you feel like each individual chapter just is its own story and it's contained within itself, and you see the purpose of each chapter. Sometimes when the plot of a book gets really big and epic, there are just some like huge highs with these epic plots, and therefore you need some lows in order to balance the plot, and those lows feel really low. Like they drag and they're kind of painful to read, but as a reader you just kind of know you have to get through them, and you have to get through all the explanation parts in order for the plot to feel well paced. But with this, I don't feel that. Like, I don't feel like there really aren't any low sections, or there aren't really any low chapters, just because the entire thing is just, at this point at least, feels like it's made up of just little short stories, and each one is describing a certain event. Maybe it's just nostalgia, and that's why I'm also really just having a great time. But there are just so few books, and especially longer series, that I just feel so engaged and excited to be reading just in the first half of the first book. I guess I was kind of going into this thinking I was going to be looking for the reason why did Harry Potter become such a phenomenon? Like, is it really that good, or is it not really that good and it just kind of, came out at the right time? So, I mean, so far it's looking like it really is that good and it really is that engaging. And yeah, so I think this is a good choice to reread the series in my 30s. I am very excited to continue. So yeah, I'm gonna continue reading, and I will update you later when I have more thoughts.
One more drink to swallow it down. I gotta get you out of my mind. But nobody said it was easy. But maybe I should have known. Guitar.
Hello, I'm back, and I have finished Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. So, okay, when I first picked it up, and I kind of flipped through it, and I looked, and I just kind of looked at the words, looked at how many pages. I was like, I remember this being such a epic story, and I was really worried that it was going to feel rushed, because it's just over 300 pages, and I just remember so much happening in this story, and I was like, oh no, it's gonna feel so rushed. This is like an entire school year is gonna happen in this book, and I just didn't want it to feel rushed. I just didn't want to think that it could feel rushed and that it could feel poorly done. But my fears were unfounded. There was nothing rushed about the book at all. I think overall the pacing of the book just felt so natural, and I was trying to pinpoint why. Like, I guess back in the day when I was reading it, I wasn't thinking too much about it. Definitely wasn't thinking about pacing and plot structure back then. But these days I am looking at that, and that's part of the reason why I wanted to read this book again in the first place, just because I really wanted to see what made it so magical. And is it really just nostalgia in my heart that's making me love this book series, and that makes so many people love this book series so much? Or is there something just truly special about it that just goes above and beyond what so many other series and books are able to accomplish? And I really, just based on this book, I really think that is the case. So I was thinking about what exactly makes this book feel just so well paced and so epic, yet homey at the same time. And I just feel like J.K. Rowling did an excellent job with giving enough explanation so that we understand the world, but without going overboard with exposition and just explaining everything, which tends to be the parts that drag in books. Out of 300 pages, Harry spends the first 100-ish pages not at Hogwarts. So this is the section where the book is describing his life with the Dursleys and his backstory, how he ended up with the Dursleys, Hagrid finding him, going through Diagon Alley, and just being introduced to the magical world, and then after about 100 pages, he ends up actually at Hogwarts. While I was reading it, and I was 100 pages in, and I was like, okay, Harry just got to Hogwarts, so all of that was basically, so everything that happened previously, that was basically set up. And then I remembered all of these things, all of these events that happened once Harry got to Hogwarts. Things just off the top of my head that I remembered was the troll being a big one, and then of course the conclusion where they go down and under the trapdoor. I had forgotten about a lot of things, like the mirror and the invisibility cloak, the subplot with Hagrid and the dragon, and using the cloak to give the dragon to Charlie. I had forgotten about all of those things. And so while I was reading it, like, so many things were happening that I was like, how are all of these things going to fit in this book and feel not rushed? After I finished, the conclusion that I came to was basically just that each chapter was so expertly crafted to feel like its own little short story. Each chapter had its own like beginning, middle, and end that made it feel like it was contained. And although we knew that this story was taking place over the course of the school year, and there were like little indications so that you knew where in the school year you were, so you did know time was passing throughout the year, so you knew generally where you were in time, but it was never really specific. I really don't know whether I like that in general or not, but in this case, it really helped because it was such a long timeline that by not being super specific about when each event was taking place and how it was related to like a specific timeline, it really just made it focused more on the events than the timeline. And I think that was really what made such a long timeline work over such a short book. So I really enjoyed the structure. I didn't think it felt rushed at all. Each important event was depicted very descriptively, and it just felt, so none of the specific events felt rushed at all, but the fact that each event in the timeline wasn't really specific, and there wasn't a lot of filler describing sections that really weren't relevant. Each chapter really was to the point, and it introduced something, an element or characters or something that was important to the general story, and it did it in a concise way, and there were no sections that were just time killers. I complain a lot about fantasy books on this channel, and the complaints are always the same. It's mainly that the characters are really thinly described, and they just kind of feel like just kind of Muppets going through, and they're just a vessel to tell the story rather than being important to the story themselves. And also the fact that the plot lines in fantasy books tend to be just so big and epic that it loses all human nuance. It's all about the plot and not about the characters. And for me, that makes it difficult to connect with the story, because if I can't connect with the characters, I probably can't connect with a story that is just far beyond reality. Like, the reason why I would be able to connect with a story that is far beyond reality is because I connected with the characters. And so those are my gripes with fantasy books in general. And so I was worried that Harry Potter would have a lot of those same elements and that I wouldn't find it as magical as I did when I was a kid, because now I'm an adult and I'm annoyed by those things. I know that, and I'm looking for reasons to not like it. So here's the thing. A lot of the same elements did show up in Harry Potter. We didn't get into a ton of backstory with any of the characters, and the plotline is quite epic. But for some reason, it worked in this case. And here's why I think it worked. For one thing, the characters, while they didn't have a ton of backstory, which is besides Harry, because we know how he originated, how he ended up with the Dursleys, that kind of stuff. But for every other character, there's not a ton of backstory, but that's okay, just because their dialogue and their personality is written so well that even with just a few interactions, we get such a vivid sense of who each character is. The characters' personalities are just unmistakable, and that makes them really fun to interact with. And when you see interactions between different characters and the different dynamics that different character pairings have, it's just so interesting, and each character just feels so unique that we don't need to know all of the backstory for each character. And I know a lot of the backstory is coming in later books, but for right now, it's okay. And I didn't feel like the book was lacking without knowing all about Snape or whoever, or the fact that really all we know about Hermione is that her parents are dentists, and even that was mentioned in passing because it's really not that important. Hermione and Snape, they're two of my favorite characters. They're so vivid. They have such great, unique personalities. And so yeah, yet again, another fear that I had going into Harry Potter was unfounded because J.K. Rowling just did it so well. Another issue that I tend to have with fantasy books is I feel like they're just so big and wordy. J.K. Rowling is just so skilled at using as few words as possible and such vivid descriptions so that she can explain this whole new world that nobody had any experience with in as few words as possible. And it still felt like a full, complete world, and it didn't feel like it was described poorly. Other fantasy books, they seem to just go overboard with the descriptions. There's just so much time spent on descriptions, and then when they're not describing things, they're going into some big event that's happening, and what gets left out is the characters, of course. So yeah, I think that ultimately that is what is making Harry Potter amazing for me. It's the fact that it's just so beautifully written, that it's such an epic storyline. There's so many characters, so many different personalities, and yet everything is just so concisely described that there's no time to get bored. And I feel like that is rare, especially in fantasy books, probably in other books too. So I can see why this book has just maintained its popularity. It really is just that good. I mean, so I was in the public library reading this at one point, and I was giggling and smiling to myself and taking clips of myself on my phone reading, and I'm pretty sure people were looking at me. I mean, I know I got some side eyes, but I don't care because I was just having such a good time. Part of this channel was just me trying to be a little bit more brave and not be so afraid of being noticed. It was a lesson reading Harry Potter in public and smiling and giggling and basically just looking like an oversized child reading a children's book in a public library. So yeah, that was an experience. So one of the things that I want to follow more closely during this read that I never followed closely before was Snape's character. Snape, I think, is probably one of the most interesting, if not the most interesting and dynamic characters in this entire series. So we know Snape turned out to be not a bad guy, even though throughout the series he really kind of just acts like a jerk to Harry, and sometimes it's not clear why. So at the conclusion of Snape's character, I really didn't think about it any more deeply than, well, he's just a jerky guy, but he was protecting Harry anyway. And I didn't get any deeper than that. But during this read, I really want to focus on all of Snape's actions, inactions, and just what he says and does, because I really want to understand his emotional state and his motivations more than I did before, because he's such an interesting character. Yeah, so that is one thing I'm going to be looking out for while I go through the series again. One last thing that I noticed was Harry and Ginny's relationship is like teased from the very first interaction. Like right when Harry first meets Ron and the Weasleys and he arrives at platform 9 3/4, or I mean the barrier between platforms 9 and 10. Ginny is introduced at that point, but really she has no role in the book. And then she pops up again at the end, really for no reason. Although, I mean, I guess she is important in the Chamber of Secrets, so maybe that's why it was important to introduce who she was in this book, but I don't know. I think so. Really, I was not a fan of Harry and Ginny's relationship. Actually, I mean, nor was I really a fan of Ron and Hermione's relationship. I am going into this series kind of with the opinion that none of the romance was necessary at all. It kind of took away from just the epicness of the story for me, which is strange for me to say, because in a lot of cases, it's the romantic element that makes the story not seem so dull. Like, at least there was some emotion happening. But I mean, I'm not a total ice queen. I don't know. I just never liked either of the pairings. I felt like Harry and Hermione would have been a better pairing than Ron and Hermione. But then if that happened, who would have Ron ended up with? Either he would have just been by himself, or he could have ended up with Lavender, I guess. But so I felt like it kind of just had to end up that way in order for it to be a somewhat satisfying ending. And then Harry ended up with Ginny, which I always thought was a little bit awkward. So I don't know. I guess we'll see as I make my way through the series if I end up thinking the relationships are any less cringy than I remember them being. So yeah, those are all of my thoughts on Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone and what I'm going to be looking for going forward through and completing the series. I had such a great time reading just this first book that was quite obviously an introduction. Like, there wasn't a lot of actual plot in this book. Like, there was the plot line that ended up with discovering that Voldemort was on the back of Quirrell's head, but really a lot of the chapters were really focusing on introducing the elements that are going to be necessary for the subsequent books so that we can really appreciate what happens in the next books. It was just amazing to be so excited about and so excited by the end about reading a somewhat plotless book, a book that was really filled with explanations that didn't feel like explanations. I just can't explain it. It's just so exceptional. Maybe as I read more books, I'll be able to pinpoint more specifically what it is about this book after I just get more experience breaking down plots. I'm just so happy and so excited, and just so excited that I've decided to do this. Okay, so I'm not going to watch any of the movies while I'm reading the books, because that's gonna probably taint my opinion even more. But once I am finished reading all of these books, I am definitely going to marathon all the movies again. That'll just be the icing on the cake. So that is all for the first installment in the Rereading Harry Potter in my 30s series. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps my channel. And I will see you in the next vlog. Bye!